concerned at what had been done. So there was a debate which happened in the public arena in the journal Antiquity, and Mike pointed out that how much evidence was needed before we would reshape something, and maybe we could leave it in a crumpled state. And that actually told us perhaps something about what had happened.
Now, another project that he was involved in was the Rose Theatre in London. What were the issues there?
Permission had been given to develop the site with a large office block. When the excavation took place, they unearthed the foundations of the Rose Theatre, which was obviously important in terms of theatrical history. It's where some of Shakespeare's first plays were performed. He may even have performed on stage himself. And people wanted to preserve the remains where they were. Unfortunately, it was far too expensive for the government to step in and buy the site. So a compromise had to be worked out. And the developers and their architects redesigned the site so that they put the piles on which the building sat in different places so that the building itself wasn't damaged. And Mike was instrumental in developing the system to keep the ground waterlogged, because still down there are the clay and some pieces of wood from the original foundation, so those need to be kept wet and waterlogged in order they will survive. And he helped devise that system, which was the first time it had been done in an urban environment, but he worked with lots and lots of colleagues and experts to establish a kind of a leaky pipe system to keep the remains waterlogged. And they're there to this day. They're preserved because of that.
Was he somebody who also helped to pioneer different techniques of archaeology?
Yes, perhaps his most lasting legacy is the role he took in developing preservation in situ, that beneath all our cities there are waterlogged deposits containing important archaeological information, and if one allowed development to happen willy-nilly, there would be a lot of damage done. So he has been instrumental in making Ethnic Heritage and other heritage organisations appreciate the value of that and that they can be saved.
So would you say that he had a major impact on the development of archaeology in the UK?
Mike was someone who undoubtedly was key in starting to make conservators and soil scientists and archaeologists and developers all talk together so that we could reach kind of holistic solutions for some of these sites and exercise good judgment based on knowledge and information.
Chris Capewell and Mike Caulfield has died aged 81. This week, last words also go to Simon Boas, who's died aged 47. Being diagnosed with throat cancer last year, Simon wrote several articles about his illness and a book called A Beginner's Guide to Dying, which is due to be published later this year. He was praised for his inspirational attitude to death. But now, if you watch TV or listen to the radio in the 1980s or 90s, you'll probably recognise this voice and its very frank subject matter.
What Kinky for me as a sex therapist does not exist. Anything that two consenting adults do in the privacy of their living room, maybe bedroom, is alright. If the two of them really enjoy it and like it.
The US-based sex therapist Dr. Ruth Westheimer became famous around the world when her TV and radio programs were syndicated. She was known for her brash, often humorous and always very open approach to talking about sex. Pierre Leroux worked with Dr. Ruth for 43 years. He was her publicist, co-author and friend.
It's an interesting topic. When she was talking to people about sex, she found that it was something that interested her, and she was good at helping people solve their problems.
Ruth was born in 1928 and brought up by her Jewish parents in the German city of Frankfurt. When the Nazis began to persecute the Jews, her family became a target.
I do remember looking out the window and seeing my father onto a truck. He turned around and he faint smile relief, and that was the very last time that I did see my father.
Her mother and grandmother put her on a train, which was a kinder transport, that took her to Switzerland.
I will never forget that day. It was on January 5th, 1939. And my mother and grandmother went to the railway station to wave goodbye. And I do remember that they were running in order to get another glimpse of me. I thought I'm going to Switzerland for 6 months.
She was put in a school that turned out to be an orphanage for the 100 or so kids who were sent there from Germany.
And I suppose the fact that she ended up in Switzerland saved her life.
Oh, absolutely. Had she stayed behind, she would have been killed in Auschwitz, like her family. No, that definitely saved her life. And all the children, they all ended up being orphans.
I think what has permitted me to do is to have a tremendous empathy of suffering for other people.
The war was over, Switzerland didn't want her. She couldn't stay in Switzerland. She certainly didn't want to go back to Germany, where there were nothing but bad memories, etc. So she went to then Palestine. She joined the Haganah, which was the predecessor of the IDF now. She was trained as a sniper, and she was wounded very seriously in a bomb blast. People right next to her died. She almost lost her legs.
And what do you think was the effect of those dramatic experiences on her character in later life?
She felt that since she had survived and all these things, the Holocaust and the bomb blast, that she had a duty to give back to society. She could not have told you then it would have been to be talking about sex.
Ruth went on to study psychology at the Sorbonne University in Paris before moving to the United States, where she completed her master's degree and then a doctorate.
She worked for Planned Parenthood here and decided that sex was an interesting topic and studied with Dr. Helen Singer Kaplan, who was one of the leading sex therapists, and that's how she went into sex therapy.
How did she first enter the media world?
There was public service programming on radio stations, and the directors of public service programming would get together once a month for a meeting. And they invited Dr. Kaplan to speak at this meeting. She couldn't or wouldn't or whatever, and Dr. Ruth said, "Oh, I'll take on that assignment."
I made a presentation to a group of broadcasters saying that we have the knowledge, we have the scientifically validated data about human sexual functioning. We have a lot of problems in the United States of unwanted pregnancies, of ignorance. I said in order to make people sexually literate, we ought to have the program on the air. I did not think that it ought to be me. Listen to my accent. I've never done any broadcasting, but NBC Radio gave me a quarter of an hour. From that, it grew to an hour, then to 2 hours, and until last year, it was 2 hours, and it became actually international. And about 5 years ago, Fred Silverman, who used to be president of NBC, asked me if I wanted to do a television program. I said, of course, I'll try anything.
What was her approach on the air? For those who haven't heard her work, how did she deal with sometimes very intimate subjects that people were asking her about?
Very openly and using the clinical words, it's not slang words, but she talked very openly about sex and what you should do.
Hello, you are on the air.
Hi, Dr. Ruth. Around 2 weeks ago, a woman had called in about having sex with her husband and another female.
Yes?
Well, I just wanted to let you know that you were right. My husband does want more, and I told him to fantasize about the event because that's what I thought you would tell me to do.
Right? And it worked?
Yes.
Terrific.
There were calls from young people, and there were calls from old people, all walks of life. As the show got more and more popular, she discussed everything. And, the AIDS crisis came, and she would talk about gay sex, and her main message was to use protection if you don't want to become pregnant, or if you don't want to catch a disease. That was very important to her.
The rate of transmission of that dreadful disease of AIDS among homosexuals has been reduced. That's because of people like myself. I'm not the only one talking about these things by saying safer sex.
She went on every talk show. The late night shows like David Letterman and The Tonight Show had her on all the time.
Very many women in our Western society fake it. Yes, that's sad. You tell him, let me show you, by moving his hand, how I can have sexual satisfaction. I haven't yet met a man who didn't like that. Now, I don't want women to go home tonight and to say to their husbands, 1, 2, 3, right, left, you know. I want them to show that with some emotion.
And do you think that she was responsible for changing people's attitudes, perhaps in the United States, but also maybe around the world as those shows were syndicated?
Absolutely, she changed people's attitudes. Certainly the gay community, so, you know, she helped make safer sex more important, but just talking about sex and admitting you have a problem around the world. I mean, Sex for Dummies was translated into 17 languages and there were 27 editions around the world. So she was everywhere.
But I have a tremendous amount of gratitude from people, and I'm very grateful for that. When people say, you really helped me, thank you, or you saved my marriage, that happens sometimes in my office, I say to myself, really, I'm a fortunate woman. And I'm having a pretty good time.
Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who's died aged 96. This week you also heard last words on the archaeological conservator Mike Caulfield, the actor Shelley Duvall, and the campaigner Veronica Smith. Don't forget there are hundreds of other fascinating life stories in the Last Word archive on BBC Sounds.
Last Word was presented by Matthew Bannister and was produced in Cardiff by Ed Prindiville. It was a BBC Audio Wales production for Radio 4. In a moment, Matthew's side goes back to the origins of the space race to question who benefited. But first, a look ahead to tomorrow evening.
She knew how to write songs, you know, she was into the craft.
1 year since her death, Radio 4 looks back on the life of Sinead O'Connor.
The conditions were improved to a point at which it was a decent and vaguely healthy work environment. You'd be back maybe in a flash, yeah, but that's not the reality of the NHS right now. It's harrowing stuff, this. Julia, thank you so much for calling in. Loads of similar stories coming through on the text and tweets. Come to those in just a moment. And lots more of your calls on the reality of working in the NHS. Also coming up,
Israel's policies and practices are contrary to the prohibition of forcible transfer of the protected population under Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention.
the International Court of Justice has ruled in the last hour that Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories do breach international law. How significant a ruling is that? We'll look at that in just a moment after those headlines. 4:30 the time with Jenny Barsby.
The head of the company at the centre of a worldwide IT outage has admitted it will be some time before the situation will be resolved. The NHS, shops, airports, train stations and banks are among the services being impacted. President Biden's team say he's planning to get back on the election campaign trail next week. He's been self-isolating after contracting COVID-19. It was rumoured the 81-year-old was going to pull out of the race as early as this weekend. And West Yorkshire Police say they've made several arrests after a night of disorder in the Hare Hills area of Leeds. A bus was set on fire, a police car overturned and rocks thrown at officers. The violence was linked to a number of children being taken into care. And we see weather after a mostly fine and sunny end to the day. Some places will see some patchy rain overnight, with temperatures dipping to 11 degrees.
LBC. Introducing the Galaxy Book 4 Edge, the new Copilot Plus PC from Samsung, packed with AI features. Purple, monkey, dishwasher.
Whoa, look, AI can't do everything, but with the Snapdragon X Elite processor, the Galaxy Book 4 Edge delivers phenomenal performance and up to 22 hours of battery life, so you can create and connect like never before.
That sounds brilliant.
The Galaxy Book 4 Edge laptop. A new AI era begins. Buy now from Samsung.com. Battery based on brightness, 150 nits and AirPlay mode on.
Gold, but still, we are the ones who beat the Russians. From the very first moment human beings landed on a celestial body in July 1969, space has been a geopolitical battleground. While the messaging suggests a place for all humankind, space is coveted for nationalistic ambition and choreographed flag-waving.
And to see that flag there for the first time, it's a big ego boost.
Over 50 years later, in 2024, this kind of symbolism was not lost on the American news network CNN when it reported that the world's most important emerging superpower had landed an unmanned spacecraft on the far side of the moon.
I'm Matthew Side, and this is Sideways, my show about the ideas that shape our lives with stories of seeing the world differently. And welcome to episode 2 of a special 4-part mini-series about the ethical dilemmas posed by space travel. I'll be taking you into the cosmos with stories of people who have been there and those who can only dream of going. Explore the moral debates that have permeated space exploration since before the moon landings and are evolving dramatically today in a new era of commercial spaceflight, of asteroid mining, and almost daily satellite launches. And in this episode, I'm asking whether space exploration truly is for the benefit of all humankind. Welcome to Sideways, a new frontier.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
20th of July, 1969, the Eagle has landed. One giant leap for mankind. It's got to be one of the most famous sound bites in history, a moment indelibly printed on human consciousness. And when Armstrong descended the ladder of his lunar module, he was presented as an ambassador for the entire species, for all humankind. His famous words sounded universal. And yet, America's motivation to finance the Apollo program wasn't entirely, or even principally, altruistic.
No question, the Cold War competition is front and center.
Roger Launius is an American historian and author of several books about the American space program. Between 1990 and 2002, he served as chief historian of NASA. In 1957, the USSR launched the first satellite to orbit our planet, Sputnik. Less than a month later, they launched Sputnik 2, a much bigger satellite with a dog on board.
That was a big deal. The Americans had done nothing yet. It's about the issues of the potential of nuclear annihilation. If you can put a satellite over our heads, you could probably put a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead down on top of our heads. And that's what sparks the decision to establish the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, later in 1958. We've got to do something to recover.
NASA had to catch up. Despite the space agency being established under the motto, for the benefit of all, the geopolitical stakes were paramount. The US and NASA were also confronting fundamental ethical questions posed by the emergence of a new frontier. They were navigating what it means for humans to venture into space.
Early on, in 1960, NASA sponsored a study that asked the question, is it better and more appropriate to create an Earth-like environment for an astronaut in space? In other words, a capsule in which there's air and all the necessities that they need to survive, versus modifying the human body. Now that raises profound ethical questions.
And here's a fact I love.
That particular study coined the term cyborgs. The results of that so terrified the NASA leadership that they just put it in a file drawer and forgot about it.
In the early 1960s, NASA looked into moral questions from what's called a utilitarian perspective. They were seeking to maximize technological benefits whilst minimizing potential harm. But such an approach brushed important issues under the carpet.
There's ones about displacement of local residents in areas where NASA sets up facilities for testing rockets, for instance, that would be viewed as harsh. And not to mention the environmental issues associated with the use of toxic chemicals in terms of the development of rocket fuels and any number of other things.
In 1960s America, the $25 billion cost of the space program was met with cautious enthusiasm by much of the public, but not all.
There were a lot of people who were not too happy about what was going on.
Neil Mayer is Professor of History at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and Rutgers University, Newark. He recently wrote a book, Apollo in the Age of the Aquarius.
I think one of the first sort of ethical questionings of the Apollo program occurred a day before the Apollo 11 launch, when the Reverend Ralph Abernathy from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference gathered with 25 poor African American families down at Cape Canaveral.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, on the eve of one of man's noblest ventures,
Reverend Abernathy stepped in as one of the leaders of the civil rights movement after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Footage of this moment has been unearthed from the Library of American Congress and WGBH archives by the director, Robert Stone. In 2019, he produced a documentary series called Chasing the Moon for the American TV channel PBS.
I'm here to demonstrate the tragic and inexcusable gulf between America's technological abilities and our social injustice.
In this video, we see dozens of people protesting at Cape Canaveral, holding signs, and one of them really drives the point home. It says, rockets or rickets, referring to the condition that affects bone development in children.
We met NASA's chief, Thomas Paine, in the middle of a field outside the Space Center. Abernathy said to Paine, "I want your NASA scientists to work on problems that my people are suffering from here on Earth."
When NASA was established in 1958 by Congress, the legislation emphasized that, to quote, American activities in space should be devoted to peaceful purposes for the benefit of all mankind. But at the time, many Americans didn't feel that they would benefit at all. While the Apollo 11 astronauts were preparing to take off for their moon mission in 1969, in Washington, politicians and NASA officials were focusing their attention on a little 3x5-foot nylon flag adorned with stars and stripes, and whether America had earned the right to stake a claim to the moon. When NASA tentatively suggested that a United Nations flag could be planted on the moon,
That got shot down immediately in the White House. It's not going to be any flag except the American flag. When there is a victory lap to be done, we're going to make the victory lap. Apollo was a nationalistic program, no question about it. And it was a contributor to a long-standing belief that Americans have about our own exceptionalism.
the context of the Cold War is, I think, absolutely crucial for understanding the political will behind the American space program. But there is another intriguing dimension sitting underneath. The significance of winning the space race, of being the very first to cross the new frontier, expresses a long-standing belief within American culture. The belief that America has a special role to play in history. And this is closely tied to a religious idea that emerged more than a century before the space race began. It's called Manifest Destiny. Before the American Civil War in 1861, the concept of manifest destiny was employed to justify the territorial conquests in Texas, New Mexico, and California.
There were a lot of people who really bought into that idea of we have been called by God to move westward, to settle this land, to create a new promised land in the New World.
Catherine Newell is a professor of religion and science at the University of Miami in Florida. In her book, Destined for the Stars, Professor Newell argues that a key motive for the American space program emerged from the Christian faith and the concept of manifest destiny.
There was definitely a lot of rhetoric around the idea of we can't let the godless Russians get to space before we do. This is something we were called to do.
And in the 1950s, one man became intertwined with the US space program and the doctrine of manifest destiny. And his mere presence at NASA made American endeavors in space both possible and highly controversial. That man was Wernher von Braun.
If we were to start today, I believe a practical passenger rocket could be built and tested within 10 years.
Von Braun was a famous rocket engineer. In 1955, he appeared on an ABC TV show produced by Walt Disney called Disneyland, Man on the Moon. In these educational films, von Braun discussed the future of spaceflight.
The ship and its crew will be ready for man's first flight in space.
Von Braun's role in the early stages of the American space program can't be overstated. NASA recognized his contribution to the development of rocket technology as pivotal. But von Braun's story doesn't start in America. During World War II, von Braun gained notoriety for his involvement in the creation of the deadly Nazi V-2 rocket, which is infamous for its use in the bombing of London in December 1944. Following the war's end, President Harry Truman officially approved a secret program to import the top German engineers and scientists to bolster American efforts during the Cold War. It was on the condition that they were not known to be or alleged to be war criminals. And Wernher von Braun was one of those approved.
He and others on his team had benefited from a bureaucratic absolution of everything they had done in Germany or been a part of that had basically been wiped from their records that even the president really didn't know. So obviously it's ethically a minefield.
For years, von Braun portrayed himself as an apolitical scientist solely interested in space exploration. It wasn't until after his death in 1977 that his membership in the SS became widely known.
At some point in his own history, von Braun had a conversion experience just a year or two after he got to the US that really sort of reshaped and recalibrated what he thought he was building rockets for. And it went from, again, this notion of maybe weapons, maybe vehicles to space, we need to explore, to very much, this is something, an ability we have been given by God, we need to use to humanity's greatest advantage, which is to leave this planet and settle or explore others.
As a prominent NASA scientist and evangelical Christian, Wernher von Braun embraced the philosophy of manifest destiny, that it was God's will that mankind should voyage into space, and that it was both America's calling and moral responsibility to be in the vanguard. In this way, the ethics of space conquest became linked to the perception of America's special place in the moral order. And yet, somewhat paradoxically perhaps, as well as the Cold War dogma and America's nationalistic ambitions, there was also a tentative spirit of cooperation that was articulated by JFK as early as 1963.
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, there is room for new cooperation. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon.
In this fascinating 1963 archival footage from the United Nations, Kennedy delivers a speech at the UN building in New York, which remains a little-known fact in the history of the space race. Because 6 years before Apollo 11 reached the surface of the moon, the president publicly offered a joint mission to the moon with the Soviets. Kennedy's motives are still the subject of fierce debate. Perhaps it stemmed from a mix of fear of losing the space race, concerns about the growing costs of the Apollo program, but just maybe a sincere desire to see if collaboration might work. But this opportunity was never pursued. 2 months later, Kennedy was assassinated. But nevertheless, the idea that a globally collaborative approach to space exploration could be the way to benefit all would eventually find a home.
The first crew of the International Space Station arrived at their new home for the next 4 months.
Fast forward to November 2000. This news report from the American network CNN shows Commander Bill Shepard of NASA and Russian cosmonauts Sergei Krikalev and Yuri Gutsenko arriving at the International Space Station on November 2nd, marking the start of an uninterrupted human presence on the orbiting laboratory.
We put together this incredible engineering achievement in the vacuum of space and did this over a period of the past, 24 years. And we've done it with Japanese, with French, with Canadians, with Russian.
Astronaut John Harrington flew on the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 2002 to deliver a new crew to the International Space Station.
My professional high point in my career was having the opportunity to be a participant in that achievement.
He spent 11 days with astronauts from around the world. And what amazed him most, apart from his 3 spacewalks of course, was the collaboration he witnessed.
I got videos of folks playing with candy. You got 2 Russians, a Japanese guy, and an American all chasing M&M's around. We're humans, we have different political structures that we come from, but in the elements, we come together and work together. I think that's what the space station itself has done in a tremendous way.
Since the year 2000, 280 astronauts, cosmonauts, and spaceflight participants from 23 different countries have visited the International Space Station. The notion that space exploration is an opportunity for humankind to collaborate remains potent. It's there in the words of Neil Armstrong, one small step for mankind, and it runs through the aims of the ISS. It's as if stepping beyond our planet gives us a chance to transcend the petty differences and disputes that characterize so much of what happens on our planet. But I have to be honest, space exploration as a means of advancing human-wide goals does seem, how can I put this, a bit of a stretch in a world of growing geopolitical conflict and tension. And it makes it even more important, I think, to at least try to create an agreed framework of rules and responsibilities that might help us to avoid conflict and recrimination in space. 1969 was an extraordinary moment in the history of human space exploration. But from an ethical perspective, 1967 might have been an even more important one.
Meanwhile, the Foreign Minister presided at the signing of the treaty banning nuclear weapons from outer space. So far, 31 nations have joined in the treaty.
This British Pathé newsreel from January 1967 announces the signing of the Outer Space Treaty. It became the Magna Carta of space regulation and established the foundational principles of space law.
Hi, I'm Michelle Hamlin. I'm a space lawyer.
A space lawyer, I've got to say, I think that's pretty cool. And what space lawyers do is establish the ground rules for space. At the UN, for example, working on international legal issues or within nations as commercial space lawyers, helping countries or corporations obtain licenses for satellite launches and frequencies.
Space law is actually very, very slim. There's only 5 treaties, so we're really talking about very few pages. And even those guidelines themselves are very inspirational. There's no should not, except for one very important one. You shall not place nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in space. Under the law space is considered the province of all humankind. And the fundamental precept in space is that it's free. So that leaves open a lot of possibility for a lot of different activities, and they're sure to conflict.
In 1967, when the Outer Space Treaty was ratified, there were only 2 spacefaring nations. Today, there are more than 100. But there are also corporations, nation-states, billionaire adventurers, all penetrating space. And there are many pressing issues today that no legal framework currently addresses. Michelle describes the moon as our test case, the first place where we will learn and figure out the rules we may later follow on other planets. And that is what makes it the most immediate place of conflict.
As far as we know, what humans need to survive, water, oxygen, hydrogen, is most focused in the lunar South Pole. And so we're seeing the United States and China, for example, planning missions to the lunar South Pole. We see a lot of commercial companies planning missions to the lunar South Pole. And what do you do when you have a treaty that says free access to all areas of celestial bodies to everybody? So if I start a mining operation and somebody comes up and says, hey, free access, let me have some of that water, that's going to cause a conflict. And that is what we need to deal with in the immediate term. The decisions we make today will influence the future of humanity.
50 years after we last left footprints on the moon, NASA's Artemis 1 is our first bold step towards getting us back there and pushing us farther than we've ever been before.
This is a promotional video from NASA announcing the launch of the first module of Artemis, Artemis 1, which inaugurated a new lunar exploration mission in 2022. This launch marks the first step of a new phase in the space age. The Artemis program is about establishing a sustainable lunar presence and preparing for future missions to Mars. It's also an international collaborative program, and from the perspective of the ethical questions I've been asking in this episode, there's one other key difference when you compare it to the NASA missions from the space race era.
There's a lot of interest in how do we understand exactly the ways in which NASA's work can benefit all humanity.
This is Zachary Purtle. Zach works as a senior policy analyst at the NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. In April 2023, Zach organized an unprecedented workshop at the headquarters of NASA. It was a forum that brought NASA engineers together with philosophers, scientists, historians, and many other experts at the intersection of space and society. Their mutual goal: to raise fundamental ethical questions.
So some of these included sustainability. We think about the scientific and environmental integrity of the moon. We wanted to be able to understand.
On Radio 4, BBC Sound. Starts tomorrow morning at 10:30.
On Radio 4 now, Anita Arland with PM.
From GP surgeries to airports to broadcast television, a tech outage that took down computer systems around the world.
The ABC has basically been broadcasting without the capacity to play tape, without the capacity to play stories.
Already delayed 2 hours. I don't know where my plane currently is. I don't know if I'm getting home today.
Why did it happen? How long will it take to fix? And how can we stop this happening again? We're going to try and find out. The International Court of Justice delivers its verdict on Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories.
By 11 votes to 4, is of the opinion that the state of Israel's continued presence in the occupied territory is unlawful.
The Palestinian foreign minister calls this a watershed moment. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dismissed the ruling as lies. Also on the programme, should he stay or should he go? In the last 20 minutes, another Democratic senator has called for Joe Biden to step down. And they're back. The spoonbills are breeding in the UK again, in some areas for the first time since the 17th century. We're going to find out what's changed. First, though, the BBC News, read today by Jane Steele.
Businesses across the world have been hit by a major IT outage caused by a faulty update issued by a cybersecurity firm. Computers using the Microsoft Windows operating systems have suffered what's known as the blue screen of death. Government officials have been holding meetings and say they've been working closely with the affected sectors. The company CrowdStrike said it has issued a new update that should fix the problem, but warned it could take some time. Nick Johnson reports.
Queues at airports and railway stations, TV channels off air, people unable to access their bank accounts or GP surgeries. The impact caused by this IT outage has been far-reaching. More than 3,300 flights have been cancelled, with the outage affecting airports and airlines around the world. NHS England said the majority of GP surgeries were unable to access their electronic records. In New Zealand, a spokesperson for the country's parliament said its computer network was disrupted and the outage hit security machines during preparations for the Paris Olympics. The cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike said the failures had been caused by a defect in one of its software updates, which affected computers running Microsoft Windows. The firm admitted it could be some time before systems are fully restored.
A Russian court has found an American journalist guilty of spying and sentenced him to 16 years in a high-security penal colony. Evan Gershkovich, who's 32 and works for the Wall Street Journal, had pleaded not guilty. President Biden said journalism was not a crime, and he was pushing hard for his release. Sir Keir Starmer has described the sentencing as despicable. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg reports from outside the court in Yekaterinburg.
Evan Gershkovich's trial had been held behind closed doors, but journalists were allowed into the courtroom for the verdict. The Wall Street Journal reporter was standing in a glass and metal cage, what passes as the dock in a Russian courtroom. The judge entered and pronounced the US journalist guilty of espionage. He sentenced him to 16 years at a high-security penal colony. Evan Gershkovich's supporters, his employer and US officials have dismissed the trial as a sham. The Wall Street Journal has accused Moscow of stockpiling American citizens in Russian jails to trade them for Russians jailed abroad.
West Yorkshire police have said a number of people have been arrested after a riot broke out in the Hare Hills area of Leeds last night. In a statement, the force said officers were targeted when dealing with what it called a child protection matter. A police car was flipped over and a bus set alight. The force have said more arrests will be made. A top UN court has said Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories since 1967 is illegal. The International Court of Justice has been issuing a non-binding opinion. Israel has said it doesn't recognise the legality of the proceedings. Our security correspondent Frank Gordon reports.
Israel's presence there was illegal, the court said. It must cease all new settlement activity and end its occupation as early as possible, and pay reparations and compensation to Palestinians. It should return land and all assets seized by Israel since 1967, it added. Israel has immediately rejected the court's findings, calling them blatantly one-sided, fundamentally wrong, reality of the Middle East. While Palestinians and others are calling this a landmark ruling, it's unlikely to change much on the ground, but it does give a stark indication of global opinion and a measure of Israel's relative diplomatic isolation on the world stage.
5 more Democratic members of Congress have called for President Biden to end his re-election campaign. Biden is recovering at home after testing positive for COVID-19. Earlier today, his team put out a statement reiterating the president's desire to stay in the race. Cricket and England's bowlers have been frustrated by the West Indies on day 2 of the second test at Cambridge.